The Spin-Off Podcast Network.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, senior writer at The Spin-Off. Next week, we'll be counting down the top 100 New Zealand television shows of the 21st century. But to celebrate the shows that were disqualified, forgotten, or just too weird, join me, Kura Forrester, Rhiannon McCall, and fellow Spin-Off writers live on stage at Q Theatre on October 31st. Prepare for a night of hot takes and cursed clips as we unearth television treasures and argue for their place in our history books. Tickets are on sale now at thespinoff.co.nz/events.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBet.
Did you see that the popular and very good podcast Between Two Beers?
Oh, yes.
It turns out, and if you look online, there's a whole series of podcasts that Between Two Beers have done in which they tackle the question of whether or not to accept Christopher Luxon's request or his office's request for Christopher Luxon to come on their pod, which presumably is part of the Christopher Luxon is in touch after all campaign, given the poll that was out this week that showed 51% said he was out of touch. Anyway, they grappled with this difficult question of whether or not to have Christopher Luxon on their podcast, and eventually decided no. After
good for them.
Much discussion that it was that because he would
Jack
tell
Tame
them what suited them.
Yeah.
Well, Jack Tame, but also
I was going to say Jack Tame
what
would be
about
in
Gone by Lunchtime?
That's right.
Oh my God.
Anyway, so I've sent in a
amazing.
bid, but I would like to reiterate that bid to Christopher Luxon, who is no doubt listening to this as he's off to attend a very important meeting in his Crown car. You're welcome on this podcast. We can have some cheerful banter.
We could talk about beer.
We could even have beers.
We could have a
do
chat.
Between Two Beers. You're very welcome, Christopher Luxon, to come on our podcast. We did invite him during the election and no dice. Now might be the time for a chat with or without beers or Diet Cokes or what have you. Tēnā koutou katoa. This is Gone by Lunchtime. I'm Toby Manhire. There's Annabelle Lee-Mather.
Kia ora.
What did you give me that look for?
I just had a little brain fade in and out. Now I'm back online. I was buffering, and now I've finished buffering.
Kia
I'm
ora,
here.
Ben Thomas.
Kia ora.
And hello to you, Te Ahi Butler.
Tēnā koutou.
Now, it's just over a year since the election, isn't it? As opposed to just over a year of the government, which is an important distinction. But let's take a moment to stocktake on that year since that momentous day in October 2023. Just over a year ago, recall, probably a year and a week ago, there were David Seymour and Winston Peters were tearing strips off each other, probably calling each other cucks a lot. And there were some quite serious warnings of what would ensue with a potential National New Zealand First Act coalition. There were warnings of swarms of locusts and second elections, and those warnings were coming from the National Party. If you remember Chris Bishop and John Key were telling us how everyone needs to think very carefully about their votes, given what might happen were there to be a three-way coalition. And lo and behold, we have a three-part coalition. Given all of that, Ben Thomas, how do you measure that first year? Those forecasters perhaps overstated the risk to stability.
Yeah, isn't there research somewhere that says that arranged marriages are happier than others?
With three participants?
I've read something in the New Yorker about how these things work very well with like strictly defined rules. Look, I think it depends at what point you take it. You know, you can't just do the sort of, what's the birth sign of this government? You have to go into, what's the rising house? What exact moment was it born? If you were taking the anniversary as, 7:15 p.m. on Saturday election night, you would probably say this is a bad outcome. At that point, National was riding high. They and ACT were looking like they'd get about 55% of the vote, and they would govern unencumbered. As the night wore on, things didn't look as rosy, and by the next day, and particularly once the special votes came in, it was clear that they needed New Zealand first. If you took the anniversary from that point, I think they would all say that it's been a stellar success. Look, it depends how on what kind of axis you measure their success, right? Which is, if you wanted to say how politically successful has it been, you'd say very much, given the circumstances in which it was created. If you wanted to say, in terms of policy change and impact, you'd say quite a lot for a year. Certainly the busiest first-term government I can remember, since the 90s, I'd say. And then, if you were saying progressive treaty policy, probably lower marks. There's a bunch of different metrics that you can use, I suppose. But I think in terms of the personal well-being of everybody in that coalition, I think much better than they would have expected.
Annabelle.
There was something that I saw, a story about Hipkins the other day that I feel kind of echoes what's happened with National in the first year, and it was a story about how Hipkins' popularity has gone down, and they interviewed members of the caucus who said, well, that might be so, but he's done a really great job of transitioning us into opposition, holding our party together, and there's no one's turning on each other, we're not leaking or any of those things, and that's true, those are all good things, but they don't get you re-elected, and they don't mean a whole lot to the public, not at this point in the election cycle anyway. And I feel that National, the coalition government is similar. They've managed to hold it together. They're not eating each other, although sometimes, to be fair, they do say things in public that they nibble. But for the most part, they are holding together. But if you look at Mikey Sherman's Varian poll the other night, most New Zealanders think they're worse off or the same this time last year. And again, that's what really matters the most.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point, because I think it's impossible to divorce the first year of the government from the continuing poor, albeit changing in the way that it's poor, economic climate. Obviously, during last year, the cost of living crisis was, the rampant inflation. That was the big story. But rates were also being cranked up by the Reserve Bank in order to try and combat that. What we've seen is that outside some parts of non-tradable inflation, so in particular, there were these sort of shocks with higher insurance prices, because this whole country is a fault line. That also seems to be a rainbow. And also big rates increases, which are not unrelated to that, because of the sort of continuing infrastructure deficit that we've got. But apart from those big ticket items, inflation has been largely sort of under control for much of this year, and the pain has really come from the high interest rates, which have sort of strangled economic activity, seen, the great standbys of our major cities disappear, Senate Communications and the Bordeaux Bakery in Wellington, SPQR in Auckland, and I think that when people sort of answer a question like that, are you, is the country better off or worse off, or in better shape or worse shape than it was a year ago? People are really seeing that, you would think, predominantly through the lens of their own circumstances. There might be people who are saying, well, I don't like the policies of this government, and that's really affecting my take on how the country's going. But when, in ordinary polling, when you're thinking about right track, wrong track, that kind of thing, it really does track, the economy really strongly. And so normally you would think it's actually a pretty poor outcome for a government not to make any gains on its polling in the first year. Normally, that's when Christopher Hipkins is gone. People have got to break out their Bring Back Chippy T-shirts from Labour as a sort of search party. But normally that's where a new government can make hay. They haven't been able to do that in part, at least, or large part, at least, because of the economic circumstances, because people are really feeling the pinch. So, they'll be counting on those sort of metrics to improve, as the economy.
And this is the point that David Seymour made in Mikey Sherman's track announcing the results of the One News, is it Varian or is it Varian poll? He made the point that given the circumstances economically, it's a pretty good result. And if one expects that the cycle is coming through, whether or not that can be attributed to the government or not, certainly must be in part, that they're in a position to restore a decent lead. Having said all that, it's kind of closer than it appears when we look at that poll, because yes, as the results are received, it would put a majority of, I think 3, perhaps it was, in the House. But the figure that is given for New Zealand First is 5%, and we don't know whether that's rounded, but let's, for argument's sake, say it was rounded from 4.9%, and were something like that to be reflected in an election, and you'd crunch the numbers again, then it's a dead heat. It's 60 each. So it's close. And there are a whole bunch of other things. While, Ben, you correctly point to us having gone through some very difficult times, and now it looks like there is a sort of sun breaking through the clouds in terms of interest rates, in terms of inflation being tamed, and we should say we're talking ahead of the inflation numbers coming out later today. There are still risks ahead, including ACC bills going up, including just the flow-on effects, including unemployment numbers which are going up. So we should probably be careful not to say, well, this is all done. I guess just coming back onto the point about Christopher Luxon, who, had a sobering result in that poll too, in his preferred Prime Minister number on 25%, albeit 10 points ahead of Chris Hipkins, and we'll come back to that and those points you make, Annabelle, shortly. I think it is worth remembering that he's often compared to his mentor, John Key, and that's a tough comparison because John Key seemed to find things, seemed to find it so easy to play the everyman, or to be the everyman, to kind of relate to people. It was almost as if everything he said was prefixed with, oh, come on, let's be reasonable. And Luxon struggles with that. But at the same time, Key, after 3 election victories, partly as a result of his qualities of leadership, managed to put together governments that had the same parties outside cabinet. He never, Bill English was his deputy prime minister. Christopher Luxon, the level of complexity in terms of the management of that cabinet is something that we've never seen before. Having 2 other parties in cabinet, that's new. And that's, from that point of view, I think you mentioned somewhere that it was an impressive HR exercise, Ben, and Annabelle, he's compared with a CEO. But as a kind of head of human resources, it's quite an impressive feat even now that coalition, which included, to repeat, David Seymour and Winston Peters absolutely going at each other, is pretty impressive.
Is it?
I think it is.
I'm not sure that it is, because I think part of the reason that Christopher Luxon is struggling in the polls is because he is frequently overruled and disrespected by one of his coalition partners, very publicly. There are members of parliament, not in National but in other parties, who seem to be failing in lots of ways to uphold standards that most New Zealanders would expect of their MPs, and they go unpunished. So I don't think that the way Luxon is managing those relationships, while he might be holding them together, are necessarily beneficial or a great example of how it's done. And while the comparison with Key is unfortunate, it is one that that Luxon has essentially engineered himself by always, calling on Key and keeping him close. The challenge for Luxon is that he became a prime minister very, very green, and his coalition partners have been able to leverage that against him. And what makes that sort of worse for him is that he talked such a big game coming in about his negotiation skills, something that Key never really did. Key didn't kind of overstate how incredible he was or how wealthy and sorted he was, any of those things. And so I think in the eyes of many New Zealanders, that kind of diminishes Luxon's mana as a Prime Minister and as someone who's able to bring the bacon home and manage his relationship with his coalition partners.
He did talk a lot, didn't he, about how he'd done mergers and acquisitions, for years and years, whether that was with Unilever, I suppose. And then was there a kind of cardinal error there, Ben, in terms of failing to see that some of the compromises that were made in those negotiations would come back to bite? I mean, the Treaty Principles Bill being the most conspicuous of those.
Yeah, I think that's true. Obviously, something went wrong in the negotiations, and most reports have traced it back to, when David Seymour and Winston Peters, came together to discuss, how they would sort of not so much negotiate as a team, but negotiate fiercely on either side. There wasn't going to be this sort of divide and rule. Now, of course, it was very easy for John Key to divide and rule in the sense that he had ACT providing him support and enough votes for a majority on the right, and he had Te Pāti Māori, or the Māori Party as they were then, on the kind of centre to provide him with sort of enough votes for a majority. And so he really could just sort of play, not even play the two off against each other, but pick and choose where he needed to go at the time. Key doesn't have that option. He needs both of them.
Luxon.
Luxon. Whoops.
He'd love that mistake.
The new John Key.
Key 2.0
needs both of them. And look, I think the comparison that I used was actually sort of for the coalition agreements, where what we ended up with was sort of one of those, those exercises, those sort of team building exercises or brainstorming, where you say there's no bad ideas. So if somebody throws out an idea, you don't find the problems with it. You say yes and then say another idea, and that seems to be how they built this agenda. So there's all these sort of overlapping, some slightly contradictory kind of policies, and what it meant was that, the part of what it meant was that they really, really loaded up on the anti-treaty stuff. In ways that individually, I think Luxon would have been able to say, look, that's just, that was just a condition of the negotiation, it's fine. The Treaty Principles Bill, as people have pointed out, admittedly we're getting on a bit, but, 18 years earlier, Helen Clark and Labour signed up to pretty much a very similar thing with Winston Peters' bill to remove the treaty principles from legislation, which was progressed to first reading, same deal as the Luxon one. So he might have thought, you could kind of get away with it, but it creates this sort of this mood. On the other hand, he is dealing with a partner, ACT, who have been pretty toey at times in the coalition. And if you look at their polling, they're actually up from the election. And so they don't have any real incentive to stop. And Luxon sort of protesting about it isn't going to change their polling. He's probably stuck with them, even if if they get back. So he has to manage that in the as best he can. Is he sort of outspoken enough about some of the problems? Not necessarily, but as a political feat, holding it all together is I think something.
Just coming back to the Varian poll, I think it's important we acknowledge the big winner.
Top.
Kia ora.
Opportunities
2%, baby.
Party have surged
Surging.
from 1.1 to 2.6. And the point I've made already is this is clearly a message from the electorate.
Mm-hmm.
Top is currently completely silent, has no leader. And this is what the people of New Zealand want more of, is nothingness. A message for...
A void. Te kore. Yeah.
Embracing the void. New Zealand act not up since the election. They're on 8 in this latest poll, haven't got 8.6 in the election. But they've come up.
They're on 9 in Varian, weren't they?
Are they? Well, we'll have to check
Is
that one
that
after.
from the election or just from the last variant?
I was listening to a podcast the other day where they said they were using AI to go in and make corrections. So they would just map their voices, and then they needed to make corrections afterwards. They would go and use. Can you do that for us, DI?
I feel like it would take away from the fabric of the podcast.
Oh, okay.
Did you see that? Did you see that column in the Post about the guy who said this new app? You just feed data into it and it creates a 10-minute podcast.
Oh yeah, it's called Notepad or something. Yeah,
joking.
There've been a few of those. Maybe we do. Basically, what you can do is we can put a transcript of our podcast into this. It's called Notepad or something like that, and then generate a podcast about our podcast.
Yeah,
in which you have a kind of couple of
we
people
do that?
discussing.
Actually,
Yeah, we'll do
that
that
would
for
be
next
really
time.
helpful.
We'll do it next time.
I'm just on the upload button. I've just got some thoughts about Don Brash and his public record. I just like the AI, the objective AI, the mysterious algorithm, to just create a podcast about whether Don Brash is.
Very quickly before we leave the government behind.
Oh, I thought you were going to sign off. I was excited. I was like, man, that just flew by.
No, I just to touch on the point that you made, Annabelle, in terms of Luxon asserting himself, I guess, is if we're casting back over the year, I think it is worth remembering that he did do a demotion, which in some ways seemed a little bit of I am being the CEO. And, you know, Melissa Lee and Penny Simmons were both demoted. And when you put that up against, say, Casey Costello, it does seem pretty harsh.
Casey Costello is a prophet. Casey Costello was beset by a vision which told her to dig for golden plates with tobacco health policy on them, which she was then able to translate, give to the Ministry of Health, before the original documents mysteriously disappeared but showed up later in a filing cabinet. I mean, isn't there any place for divine revelation in our politics?
All right, well, that's enough of that. The opposition parties, Chris Hipkins, you mentioned, Annabelle, and he's on 15% in this latest poll, and he has been kind of deliberately, it seems, focusing on, I guess, stability. The way I sort of see it is that he's so focused on the rather hackneyed mantra of not barking at every passing car that he's not barking at all. And there's a certain amount of, maybe that's fine, it's a year of consolidation, they need to work out their tax policy. But for both Labour, and then I think this also of the Greens and Te Pāti Māori for that matter, there is an awful lot of material out there to be being oppositional on, because this government is going so hard and so fast on such a wide range of areas. Yes, you have to be selective, but has Te Pāti Māori properly managed to harness the pushback against all those changes? Has the Green Party, with its many distractions, some of which are tragic and some of which are unforced errors, has, when you think about the fast track legislation, when you think about the climate change measure, there's so much space there, and it doesn't feel to me as though any of those party of oppositions has properly managed to start putting runs on the board.
Yeah, I think, to be fair to Te Pāti Māori, they've had some pretty successful nationwide activations, but I think getting into some of the finer detail, like, Takuta Ferris could probably have had a presence at the Dunedin protest, and, obviously Hauora is a big issue for Māori. So I think there's some more kind of regional issues that they could be digging into. In terms of Labour, look, you get voted out of government because people are sick of you, right? They're sick of the sound of your voice. And I think it's fair to say people were pretty sick of Labour by the time of the last election. So you do have to be strategic. However, like you say, when there is so much on offer, you don't necessarily have to bark at every car, but you can certainly be pointing them out and thinking of creative ways of highlighting them to the public and to the media. And I don't think Labour are doing a very good job there. Again, in terms of opposition parties, remarkable to see the Greens have gone up, despite the absolute shit show of a year that they've had. And I think that's a testament to Chloe's leadership.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that. You could say, imagine where they might be if they were actually focused on being fully in opposition mode rather than dealing with internal issues.
Yeah, although, there's still. I see that Chloe's started asking questions in Te Reo in the House, and I mean, it's fine, I suppose, but these things do seem to be kind of distractions, or maybe not. Maybe they're really good for clipping for social media or something. But I don't know. It strikes me. Yeah, I can't remember any particular issue that they've really run with, other than, I suppose, the fast track legislation. But other than that, just kind of generally government is bad sort of stuff, and kind of falling in either to support Te Pāti Māori or just lining up legal papers. So, but as you say, a testament first of all to Chloe Swarbrick, who's probably the most articulate party leader, along with Seymour and Peters, and also, I think the continuing weakness and silence of Labour. Aisha Varel's been very busy in health. She's obviously had a lot of opportunities. Although I think it's interesting as people try and sort of unpick through the Health NZ accounts. I saw a piece today that said, that the government is trying to be alarmist over the Health NZ deficits, and some revised figures show that the deficit for this year is only 800 million, which is actually $50 million better than the deficit in the last year of the Labour government. And I'd actually gone back and looked, and Health NZ, since its inception, it's been running sort of $1 to $2 billion over its budget every year. So I think, the idea that either there's a manufactured crisis or there's a crisis that is laid at the feet of the current government is probably not correct, but at the same time, very fertile ground for the opposition. The health system obviously is in crisis, and Labour seem to be making a little bit of headway there, but not really on a lot of other issues.
It's interesting, the health thing, because if you're that over budget every year, and the health system is still in crisis, then maybe it's because the budget is wrong. Maybe it's because what we're budgeting for health is simply not enough.
Well,
yeah, for sure, and that could be the case, But part of and this is the long-term issue, and these issues are going to persist beyond this government, is that we say that about healthcare, we say that about education, we say that about local council rates, which have gone up massively this year, but still massive infrastructure crunch. NZTA only has the enough money to fund half of the projects on its list, potentially. And we're finally sort of, I think, having to come to grips with the idea that we're a bit more of a middle-income country than a high-income country these days. And political expectations haven't changed. People's expectations of the services they require from government haven't changed. And, there's going to have to be some reconciliation of these things at some point. Either we get the magical productivity boost that every politician has been promising for 30 years, or we find a much, much more effective way of doing public services, which things like social investment are intended to move towards. But again, we haven't seen the product of it yet. But otherwise, a capital gains tax isn't going to do it. There's these.
What about if we put a very, very, very long tunnel underneath all of Wellington?
That's crazy.
That might do it.
It would have to be incredibly long. It would have to go from the airport to the central city.
That's going all the way to Nelson. Just a really
alongside so the ferry will be rail enabled, and it will travel on a rail through the tunnel.
Well, it will board a ferry, and then the ferry will go on rail through the tunnel. This is the kind of thinking that you're not getting.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, senior writer at The Spin-Off. Next week, we'll be counting down the top 100 New Zealand television shows of the 21st century. But to celebrate the shows that were disqualified, forgotten, or just too weird, join me, Kura Forrester, Rhiannon McCall, and fellow Spin-Off writers live on stage at Q Theatre on October 31st. Prepare for a night of hot takes and cursed clips as we unearth television treasures and argue for their place in our history books. Tickets are on sale now at thespinoff.co.nz/events.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spin-Off. You can help us keep all of The Spin-Off's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Annabelle, who are the performers? Who are the people the individuals over the last 12 months that have impressed or surprised you in New Zealand politics?
I've been very surprised by Darling Tana. Impressed by Chloe. Impressed by young Hannah and how she's held her own in quite a difficult, challenging environment. Tamitha also.
The youngsters.
The youngies. We love the youngies and the energy they bring. I think Judith Collins has had some strong moments. I admired her position on holding the line for the judiciary when some of the MPs were playing up.
Do you know, I was going to say Judith Collins, so I'm frustrated that you've stolen my thunder there.
Oh, sorry.
But having on this podcast and elsewhere, we've all been quite critical of Judith Collins at various moments. She's shown what an incredibly effective, hardworking, engaged portfolio minister she is.
I agree.
And as Attorney General, as you point out, recently in defence, speaking sort of candidly, compassionately, and as directly as possible about the sinking of the Navy ship, and calling out the misogynistic comments about the captain.
The armchair admirals, I love that.
Admirals. And then, but also if you talk to people in the, tech startup world, where she has the portfolio for, what has it been? Innovation and...
Science, innovation and technology.
Yeah. She is so busy. She's kind of every day getting up at crack of dawn and going and visiting one of these outfits. Now, she's not a kind of obvious startup type person, but neither does she pretend to be. But she's kind of curious and engaged, and the people in that sector say they're seeing a lot of her and they're really impressed by the extent to which she is interested in what they're doing. So, yeah, bouquet for Judith Collins. Ben?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I've got a lot of tech clients, and they say that she's the most engaged minister or spokesperson that they've ever encountered in the portfolio. And now she's the minister, so... And look, I've got to take my lumps. I think I was a Judith booster for pretty much all of her career, but I sort of thought she should probably go after the leadership. But I think going back to Luxon's,
Yep.
8 wins,
Yep.
I think that his decision to bring Judith back into the fold was probably the best one piece of people management he's done as leader so far, because she has a huge workload. She, just like in the Key government, she is right at the top in terms of the competence of the ministers. Huge appetite for work, and yeah, she's a strong performer. I think Chris Bishop has really impressed me. As a sort of, I tend to look at things often through a sort of bit of a PR lens, but I really like the way that in his...
Owing to the fact that you are, I think to quote someone on you, a PR maven. Is that correct?
A PR, yeah. No, a PR raven?
Raven.
Was it a
Yeah,
raven or a
like-
Pretty
maven?
sure it's a maven.
Is a maven a girl? though?
Raven maven.
Oh, that's why it was so confusing. Like, it's like, but I think Bishop is doing the best out of any of the government ministers in terms of sort of setting a narrative for big policy change. He seems to have this sort of formula when he announces things. He'll, news will leak, or one of the papers will kind of get word that a speech is going to be delivered. Then the speech or the announcement will happen. Then he'll release a cabinet paper as well, which has, his cabinet papers really are a cut above others in terms of the way that they're written, and sort of both informative but also to persuade.
An iambic pentameter.
And he does create this narrative. He's willing to push back on sort of some National Party shibboleths, not enough to keep the old density rules, but that was kind of forced on him, I think, by the party in opposition. But he really will push back. When people say, "Oh, what about shoebox slums?" and he says, "Well, those will be homes for people." And so I think in terms of really creating a story about where he's going and kind of helping take the public with him, and in terms of policies that I think will actually help in the infrastructure space, which as I just discussed is looking pretty bleak if the status quo continues. I think he's been a standout performer. Erica Stanford, I think if the education reforms are followed through, they will they will be hugely impactful, and I think she's fronted them very well.
I would have had her on my list had she not taken the 30 million away for the deal.
Oh, now I discovered in between our podcasts that's going to be recontracted, so it's apparently not lost forever.
Hey,
Is this
Ben,
an
can I
official
just...
government announcement?
I don't think.
Yeah, it's official. It's
okay.
official.
All right.
Ben, can I just say in terms of Bishop, I think what he has going for him is what Christopher Luxon would like to have, which is that kind of key style of colloquial communication that is kind of something for the everyman, but can also draw on kind of, the business kind of terminology as well that makes business corporate folks feel like he knows what he's doing, but isn't speaking above the head of New Zealanders and doesn't come across as boastful.
Yeah, that's right. I think a bit earlier in his career, I think he was a little bit bombastic, and he's really...
the university debater has been kind of...
and I think he hits the tone really well now. I think Nicola Willis, look, one former politician who held a finance portfolio told me that they thought that putting together the budget for this year would have been the toughest one since 1991. Ruth Richardson's one. Look, did it solve everything? No. Are there still questions about, how they'll stick to the operating allowances? Yes. This is, it's still a work in progress, but I think in terms of, being able to front up, being able to answer questions, being able, again, to put a sort of narrative around what's happening and sort of explain it to the public. I think Nicola Willis has done really well. Simeon Brown just keeps plugging away being Simeon Brown, just, got a massive workload that he's sort of just working through. He's sort of on the front line with transport, with energy. In the coalition partners, I think David Seymour, once again, very effective. I certainly wouldn't agree with any of his treaty policies, but the polling is staying up in the stuff that doesn't get votes, but I think is very worthwhile and good substantive change. The Ministry of Regulation is up and running. It's a central ministry that gives him a real pole position on policy. Winston Peters, ever the statesman as Foreign Affairs Minister, except for maybe in matters
So basically, you
He's
love
listing
everyone.
everybody. He's
You're
listed the whole
everyone.
cabinet.
Everyone's
He's
great,
listed
Ben.
everyone.
Okay.
Well, no, I
thank
think the other one, Shane
Who else do you
Jones.
love?
Oh wait,
Yeah.
he left someone else.
Oh,
Shane
right.
Jones is the
Okay.
surprise. In that Jones has never been known for his work rate, right? You generally don't associate Shane Jones with sort of getting through the papers and the work. But he's really had a new lease of life in this government.
Famous for campaigning from
He
his
can't
kitchen
do
window.
he can't do the worst ones because he's literally put everyone in the best one. So that's great.
It's good. He's just run down the list.
Well, I mean, yeah. Look, I mean,
Do you think he's going for the vacancy as Christopher Luxon's head of press?
I
That's what's
reckon.
going on here. Will you rule yourself out of the running for Christopher Luxon's new head of press?
Yeah, sorry, I don't have the time.
You mentioned Simeon Brown, and I think it's one other thing worth touching on in terms of coalition management is that the National Party is and has long been a coalition in itself. And the fact that Chris Bishop and Simeon Brown, who I think if you put them on lie detector tests, see the world through very, very different eyes. The fact that seems to have all be running smoothly, at least for now, is also something. Casting out to the year ahead, you mentioned Nicola Willis, Ben, who has done a really strong job in her nearly first year as finance minister.
I'm amazed that people think that, to
Do you
be
not
honest.
think?
No.
Oh, I think she's.
I think
she's
that the inter-island ferry situation alone is an absolute
that didn't go
debacle.
well.
What is
That's
it,
true.
$500 million?
on the South
Oh,
Korean
and-
ferry.
How can we say that she's done a good job when literally $500 million has been completely blown and there's no backup plan about what's going to take its place? $500 million of taxpayer money and a cost of living and infrastructure crisis when our hospitals are on their knees. I'm kind of flabbergasted that people could see just for that alone as her performance being a strong one, to be honest.
Well, no. So I think as finance minister, especially one who's putting sort of red lines through, whole areas of expenditure, it becomes that kind of, Chairman Mao asked about the French Revolution, too soon to tell kind of thing. Look, obviously there will be downstream effects of things that,
Literally downstream effect when a ferry goes underwater.
Tunnel.
Kia ora.
Okay, first of all, if there's one thing that we know about our ferries, it's that they can find land.
That did seem.
If they could hit the
a bit.
water, their performance would have been improved by 50%. Like,
I think you make a good point, Annabelle. It does seem as though that ferry announcement was done a little bit hastily, and that had not been. It was almost as though, look, I'm putting a marker down, I'm drawing a line through it. But what I wanted to get onto was
the fast track approvals bill. That there was one of the projects was the dry dock in
Northport. Yeah,
it's like. The whole Cook Strait is a potential dry dock. It's like, we can make a dry dock out of anything. Kiwi number 8 wire mentality.
Nicola Willis. That was a neat transition to talking about having watched the Mood of the Boardroom live stream the other week, and Nicola Willis was impressive, and Barbara Edmonds was really impressive. And I'm just sort of, as we cast ahead to the year to come, I think Barbara Edmonds, who is new to that very big job, but has, I think, a respect from a lot of people in the business community. She's, she understands the nuances and all the technicalities, all that money stuff that you and I obviously talk about a lot.
Yeah.
And it will be an interesting year, it seems to me, in terms of now that she's sort of set a foundation for Barbara Edmonds to start to really challenge Nicola Willis in finance. What do you think to that, Ben? And what else do you see as looming as the big risks and opportunities of the year to come?
Yeah, I think Barbara Edmonds, she's top shelf talent. She's got very good people skills and EQ, very good technical knowledge, been around politics for a long time, despite having sort of come from the departments. She's got a huge future ahead of her. I think the biggest danger for her is the same as Kieran McNulty faces, which I think is why he's probably keeping a low profile, is that they accidentally get drafted in as leader sometime.
Yeah.
And I think she did a podcast with Liam Dan at the Herald and said, he said, "Do you want to be Prime Minister?" And she was like, "Be Prime Minister?" When people ask that, I say, "Are you kidding? I've got 8 kids." And I'm like, well, she's still a young woman. She's got time to reach Jim Bolger level and actually qualify. Eight kids shouldn't be disqualifying. It's near enough. But yeah, I mean, look, there's plenty of risks ahead. I think the structural risk ahead for the government in terms of how it's formed is that right now, I think part of the reason that they've gotten along so relatively well and things have worked, at least within the coalition, reasonably smoothly, is that they've had a lot to get on with. Those coalition agreements, they're all stacked up. Everyone's busy getting stuff done, and it's been very inclusive. It hasn't been about moderating other people's wishes. It's been about, yes, you can have that, not let's make a compromise on this. As new things arise, issues arise, and we've already seen publicly discussion about the ferries, what's going to happen there, because that was outside the coalition agreement. And that's where you'll start to see fissures and disagreement and potential kind of, relationship problems, I think, in the coalition. The other thing is that the treaty stuff isn't going away. The treaty principles bill is really... it's the loudest and biggest thing that's happening, but Newsroom had a very good story about the treaty clause review that's going to be initiated. It's actually going to have much more of a substantive effect on treaty rights and legislation.
In the New Zealand First Coalition Agreement.
That's the New Zealand First Coalition Agreement, so 28 bills, including big ones like Resource Management Act, Crown Minerals Act, Conservation Act, Environment Act, are all going to be reviewed. And it's pretty clear from the discussion, from the interview with Paul Goldsmith that, with not necessarily just codifying what rights have been sort of found by the courts under those clauses, but maybe with looking at kind of doing away with them entirely. So there's that. It changes the Marine and Coastal Area Act. There's a lot going on, and I think that will whether the sort of public's appetite for that kind of thing will diminish once the economy improves. People tend to be a little less worried that somewhere someone is getting something that they're not, that they can't quite name, if they're doing okay themselves and they see themselves getting ahead. So that would be my prediction. That's been the way it's been in the past. But of course, around the Western world, we've got a few, division and sort of polarization is kind of increasing. So, kind of hard to tell. And the other thing, of course, is the economy. More than anything, that will dictate the fortunes of the government, particularly the National Party.
Yeah, small election coming up in a few weeks as well in America. What are you seeing, Annabelle? You're ahead.
I completely agree with all of the points that Ben has just made, particularly when it comes to, the issue of treaty rights and whether or not there's an appetite for it. There will be an appetite for it in 18 months. Duncan Grieve wrote a really interesting piece about that issue off the back of the mood of the boardroom. And, he talked about how this government has completely embroiled itself in culture wars politics and not focused enough on the issues that matter most to New Zealanders. I think they've kind of been able to get away with it so far because, as Ben mentioned, because of the cost of living crisis, people generally are more resentful. In terms of risk, I think, besides from the risk to treaty rights, that the risk that will impact all New Zealanders is our incredibly fragile infrastructure and the crisis that we face as a nation, because wherever you look, we are in trouble. Our hospitals, our cities, our water, our public transport. All of those things are a real problem. And we, on one hand, the right has done a very good job about talking about creating a sense of fear in the public about national debt, getting into debt, spending too much money. But if we don't make these investments, if we're not prepared to take on the debt, how are we ever going to be a rich country when all of this stuff is failing us? So I think that that's the major issue that we face. And we see it in all sorts of ways, like, Manua Nui sitting on a reef in Samoa. Ron Mark described the purchase of the Manua Nui as like a really innovative way of being able to solve an issue, which is that there wasn't the appetite to buy a new Navy ship, and so they went out.
Trade Me.
They went on Trade Me. They went on Gumtree, I think it was actually, and purchased this vessel, which is designed for working off the coasts of Norway, not on coral reefs in the Pacific. And because it's not a naval ship, they were limited in terms of how they're able to react to this situation that we're in, because you can't seal off different bits and parts of it. But like naval ships are so critical to New Zealand, in terms of protecting our exclusive economic zone, monitoring our fisheries, providing assistance to the Pacific and that. And now we've just landed, thousands of tons of diesel on a Pacific island. Chogama's coming soon to that neck of the woods. And what New Zealand people are going to be like, can you smell, does it smell weird here? New Zealand's going to be like, no, can't smell anything. What do you mean? No, I can't smell. I can't.
So China's allowed to build artificial islands on the Pacific for its military.
Yeah,
and New Zealand can't put a little stake in the ground.
This is our Sierra Madre South China Sea play.
Yeah, but it's one thing when our lack of investment in infrastructure affects us, but when it's literally affecting our Pacific neighbours, that's a problem, and it's a bad look for us internationally as well.
I mean, I do think
we're not winning hearts and minds quite as much as we probably would have hoped in the Pacific, given the sort of current geopolitical climate.
Last thing, when you talk about health and warnings ahead, I do think what happened in Dunedin recently with that massive turnout on the streets really underscores the extent to which people are conscious about the stress on the health system. And yes, it's been a recurring theme across very many years, but there are points at which the seams start to get really stretched and they kind of emerge into public. And that's the one thing I think that will, bring together a bunch of different strands in the year ahead, and will be something that Dunedin Hospital debacle issue challenge will have really thrust into the immediate foreground for the government. Is that it? Are we done? Anything else? Have we covered it off?
Do you love anyone else, Ben?
Has he gone through? He's still going through the list of cabinet people, so he can mention them as Casey Costello.
You guys have got a real deficit mindset, You feel
Nicole McKee.
Anyone been surprising and impressive? Yes, and this is a celebration. This is 1 year on. This is. Have you guys never been to a first birthday before? They're happy but boring occasions.
A very Merry Christmas to all our listeners. We'll be back soon. Kia ora.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, senior writer at The Spin-Off. Next week, we'll be counting down the top 100 New Zealand television shows of the 21st century. But to celebrate the shows that were disqualified, forgotten, or just too weird, join me, Kura Forrester, Rhiannon McCall, and fellow Spin-Off writers live on stage at Q Theatre on October 31st. Prepare for a night of hot takes and cursed clips as we unearth television treasures and argue for their place in our history books. Tickets are on sale now at thespinoff.co.nz/events.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spin-Off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.